please feel free to submit any live questions. And if not, we'll most likely get started. What do you think, Ivana? Start with weed control?
Let's start with watering, actually. I feel like watering is going to be one of those that'll cover a lot of people's questions right now, especially as it's getting a little hot outside or staying a little hot outside.
Perfect. So in terms of watering, certainly, oh, perfect. We do have a question.
Just in time.
All right, Sridhar, I'm specifically looking for guidance to handle patches in the lawn. What steps should be taken to fill in the patch? Great question. So let's see here.
I would say it does depend on if you have a warm season lawn or cool season lawn, but we'll go over both of those.
Let's start off with cool season since I get to chat here and pick my grass. So cool season grasses. So ideally, if we were to picture a cool season grass, so essentially, if we had to take a general or make this a general line throughout the country, right? The north of the transitional zone, I would say essentially north of Carolina, right? So this would include your fescues. So for example, tall fescue, creeping fescues, fine fescues, ryegrass, bluegrass, etc. So if those are any of the grasses, or if you feel that you have a mix of grasses in the lawn, quite common for a cool season lawn, this is where I would start. And so with these grasses, I would really view the spring and the fall to be the ideal times to be repairing the grass, right? So this typically translates to once both the daytime and nighttime temps are consistently between 50 to 80 degrees or so for the following several weeks. I would say, so I'm located just south of Buffalo, New York. So I'm typically looking to wait to seed until maybe late May or so, just since we can get a frost in May or some cooler temps at night. Want to make sure that provide enough time for the grass roots to establish before the summer heat hits, but also just want to make sure we don't seed too early. And then I'd be looking to seed most likely late August, early September. So for the majority of cool season grasses, right? We have a bit of flexibility there. But the good news is if you have some patches in the lawn and you do have a cool season grass, we're getting just about at the time where we'd be looking to repair these areas. But for a warm season grass,
Oh,
yeah, Yvonne, take the reins.
Figured we could tag team it. Yeah, so for warm season grass, the first thing you want to do is remove any of the material there, probably rough up the soil a little bit. I always recommend adding a little bit of topsoil or compost. And since this is a hotter time, I would just try to encourage the rest of the grass to fill in there. So adding that topsoil or compost will encourage some what we call runners. They're basically vines coming off the grass to fill in other areas. And adding that material there will help those fill in. Once it's gotten just a little bit cooler, warm season grass does like the heat, but not if it's 100 degrees. So, if it's getting around 80 degrees, you can actually cut some runners from other areas of your lawn to put into that area to grow and to fill in. Some warm season grasses don't have seed, so something like a St. Augustine or hybrid Bermuda isn't going to have any seed. So this is what I would rely on. But if you have something like a zoysia or a common Bermuda, if you got centipede grass, something like that, you can use seed to fill that area in. But typically, this late in the season, as hot as it is, I would just try to encourage the surrounding grass to fill that area.
Yeah, and Ivana, what are your thoughts? You alluded to this, right? With Bermuda, for example, we have a bit more flexibility just with how quickly that seed germinates and establishes. But for like a centipede or a zoysia, we're especially getting a bit late, right?
Yeah, it's gonna take a long time for either of those seeds to start to germinate. So I would just rely on trying to get the rest of it, encourage the rest of it to fill in. If you have a lot of bare areas, or if you have a large area that needs to be covered, you can always just add a little bit of sod. You could take one square and cut it up because it will start to fill in. You just want to be mindful again of the temperatures outside. A lot of things aren't going to grow when it's 100 degrees. So just adding a little bit of soil for now and then kind of reassessing once temperatures cool and see what you can kind of get away with.
All right. In terms of rain, certainly a great a great point to bring up here and allows us to tackle this report here. So certainly an interesting season. So I've been noting in our webinars earlier this year, especially if you were in the Northeast or a portion of the Northeast near Buffalo, is one of the driest springs that I can remember. Got a little bit more precipitation recently, but certainly an interesting season, right? And then it was really the areas where we expected to have a bit less rain hold on. The areas which tend to receive a bit more rain ended up being a bit drier, right? So it's definitely an interesting spring, led to potential drought stress concerns, but then also if there was any natural precipitation coming in, we then started to see some disease concerns pop up as well. So if you feel this year has been extremely difficult, you're certainly not alone. Considering where we're at this point in the year, right, from a pure temp perspective. So heat stress and drought stress are separate, right? But if we were to consider just from a temp perspective, the majority of the country is experiencing much warmer temps this year, right? So it's been a very difficult summer. And in terms of natural precipitation, you can see, Ivana, you might want to take the reins on this one with our dear Texas. But the amount of natural precipitation, we're going to be struggling here for a bit, right? We're going to be working through some drier conditions. So we can certainly chat a bit more from a drought stress perspective in just a bit here. But the primary question here was in terms of having a lot of rain with applications. Can we move forward with the nutrient pouch applications? So give me one moment. And Ivana, while I'm finding that slide, you want to chime in at all about Texas and water or lack of rain in that case?
Yeah. So right now, Texas, other areas in the Southwest are being hit with a lot of drought stress. And this combined with watering restrictions has made it very difficult for a lot of people's grasses to really be able to grow or even stay green. So if you're in an area with very severe drought restrictions, I noticed somebody who wrote in is not able to water at all. This is something where you do want to just keep your lawn in maintenance mode. You don't really want to encourage a lot of new growth at this time. If you are not able to irrigate, but you're still able to hand water, you do want to try to give your lawn about ½ an inch of water a week by hand watering, just to sustain it and keep it alive until you're able to return to an irrigation schedule. If you're able to water once a week, that's going to be basically just enough to keep it going. It might still be able to actively grow. If you're able to water twice a week, that's going to be, the best case. But just be mindful of the drought restrictions in your area and kind of what you can do to keep your grass alive in that time.
And so specifically with the significant amount of rain, of course, we want to make sure that we aren't applying the pouches when there's rain in the forecast for 24 hours or so, right? We don't want to essentially flush the contents of the pouch. So to this specific question, yes, it can certainly be difficult to incorporate the pouches if it's been a very wet season, but just remember that we do have a good amount of flexibility in terms of being able to incorporate these pouches. So as the temps start to drop here and hopefully starts to dry out a little bit in the fall, please feel free to follow up with questions regarding, I have X, Y, and Z left. When can I incorporate these pouches? But yeah, like I said, the schedules are built to allow quite a bit of flexibility. And as long as we're able to reach that desired nitrogen load over the course of the season, I'm happy. Ideally, we'd be applying the pouches at the recommended time, but can certainly incorporate them over the course of the year or later in the season if needed. The other point I want to bring up here, though, is with a significant amount of rain, we can start to see fungal blooms or potential disease concerns, right? So if you start to see yellowing in the lawn, especially lesions on the grass blades themselves, keep in mind that most fungal issues aren't going to respond well to fertilizer applications. There are exceptions, but we want to be mindful with not defaulting to a fertilizer application if the grass is starting to yellow. So if you have received significant amount of rain recently, you're starting to see the grass yellow, it seems like the grass should be thriving with the amount of rain. Please feel free to send in close-up photos as well, but most likely could be working through a fungal bloom. And once the excess moisture essentially is removed or it dries out a little bit, we'll see the grass improve naturally, and then we'll be able to incorporate the pouches.
I do see Susan had a question for moles. So moles can be, a huge factor impacting your lawn. They'll start to make tunnels. They'll break up the grass a lot. Usually with moles, if you're trying to find a sustainable solution, it's basically going to be out stubborning them, stubborn and whatever, being more stubborn. So one thing to do would be to collapse any of the tunnels that they make. So just pushing them down with your foot and maybe filling them in if you're able to. One thing I've seen that works very well is castor oil. So spreading some castor oil around the entrance of these holes. They don't enjoy the smell. They will leave that area. But basically it's going to be repeat actions that will keep them away. I have seen some good results with sound, those kind of like ultrasonic sound systems that you put in the lawn. You do just want to keep in mind, your neighbors, dogs, things like that, that will be able to hear it. But those are all things that will be a more sustainable, more friendly option for the moles. But it will be something that you're going to kind of have to work toward, for a while until they finally find somewhere else to go. And I did see that you had a question about some ground covers for shaded areas. It does depend on your area, but there are a lot of really great options out there. Things like Triscantias can be a great option. Vinca, if it's not in an area where it's weedy. But if you want to chat more about it, just shoot us an email, webinars like Get Sunday, and I can find your location and make some more targeted recommendations.
All right, Mona Cherie, great question from DC. And why know when to plant zoysia grass all day, sun in the backyard? It's a really great question, right? And so certainly a couple of components here to consider when chatting about zoysia in DC, right? And so if we return to that warm season grass map, right? Let's see, my apologies for flipping through the slides here. The easiest answer here is that DC is a bit north of where we'd recommend to go with zoysia. It's not to say it's impossible, right? There are certainly customers who opt to seed with a warm season grass, but just keep in mind that there are going to be potential difficulties, especially if we have a cool season grass in the front lawn and then back lawn we have zoysia, right? So ideally, I'd be looking to get that zoysia seed down. From a soil temp perspective, typically once temps are consistently above 68 degrees or so, I'd say it's most likely, what would you say, Yvonne, probably late May, early June at the earliest?
I think so, yeah.
So it would be something that I'd be looking at preferably next year, unless it is established and we're just looking to, ideally earlier in the season, but can certainly discuss in more detail if preferred, and pros and cons of having zoysia versus some of the other grasses. Certainly a beautiful grass, but the repair perspective or essentially getting it established can be a bit more complicated.
All right, and I see Liz has an application question, so Will, I might send this over to you, but basically her front lawn has gone dormant and half her back lawn is dormant. She's got some extra bags remaining from the first two applications. And she feels that the rest of her grass is going to go dormant by the next application. And she's kind of wanted to know, how would she go about applying these pouches that she missed?
Yeah, great question, Liz. And so for right now, as you noted, I expect that we're essentially going to hit pause, if you will, right? And so as the temps start to drop, then we can start to incorporate these pouches. So for example, if we can really tackle this however you'd like. So just essentially start incorporating them from the earliest pouch, which you missed, right? And just work through them in that manner. We're looking at allowing at least 7 to 10 days in between different pouch applications just to minimize the risk of over-fertilization. So in theory, we could incorporate several pouches within a month, right? But just want to be mindful of the time of year, making sure we're not providing too much fertilizer before the grass starts to enter winter dormancy, right? So priority right now, let's hit pause, evaluate once the temps start to drop a bit, and then we can go from there. But we can certainly, I just work through it in that manner of allowing at least a week or so in between the pouches and work through them.
I see Adam has a question about controlling crabgrass, so I can take that one. So crabgrass is something that really enjoys being mowed short if you're mowing, enjoys frequent watering, and it will, spread rapidly, as we know. So as far as crabgrass control goes from a holistic standpoint, my first thought is always to mow a little bit higher. If you have basically any grasses besides Bermuda, mowing, higher than around 3 inches, 3.5 inches even, is going to help start to control the crabgrass a little bit. because it kind of opens up the crown of the plant. It wants that sun to hit the crown. So when you're shading it out, it's not as able to get the energy it needs to spread. Another thing with that is to mow often. I know it's hot. I know you don't want to go out there very often, but making sure that you're mowing off any of those seed heads, mowing its runners, things like that, bagging your clippings, making sure that we're moving that from the lawn from that area. Those will both really help control the spread of crabgrass as well. If you're in a warm season area and your grass is actively growing, you can, if you hand pull it, the grass should be able to recover that area, start to fill in. I always recommend hand pulling first just because it's, the fastest thing to get results. But if there's a large patch of it, I know that's not a very sustainable option. So just working on controlling it for now. And then once it's time for you to either seed or it's a time when your grass can recover itself, you can use something like our Weed Warrior to kill it off in patches and allow your grass to fill in from seed or from runners.
And Mary, follow our steps in terms of prepping the soil before seeding. So scuffing up the soil a bit, adding a bit of topsoil, and then using our grass seed, but mostly weeds grew. Certainly sorry to hear that, but just as a brief overview, and Ivana, feel free to chime in here too. But I always try to highlight whenever we have questions regarding, I seeded and it seems like all I got were weeds, right? What could have gone wrong? Well, we can certainly walk through the seeding process, right? So depending on the type of grass, again, for a cool season grass, looking for tends to be between 50 to 80 degrees or so for the following few weeks. With a warm season grass like Bermuda, I'd say once daytime temps are more consistent in the 75 to 80 degree range or so, have a bit of flexibility there. So that's step number one, right? Consider the temps to ensure that the seed's going to germinate. Secondly, prepping the soil, just as Mary noted. So removing any dead grass, mowing a bit shorter than normal for just looking to overseed, right? Scuffing that soil up a bit, potentially aerating if the soil is compacted, adding a bit of topsoil to help build a new layer of soil, if you will. If you're using just grass seed, then adding that grass seed and covering with a very light layer of topsoil, maybe a quarter of an inch thick or so, just to help increase moisture retention and keep that seed in place. And that's really what I would consider from a preparation standpoint. And then thirdly, just making sure that we're providing enough moisture. So depending on the time of year, most likely watering once a day or so if you don't receive any rain. For warmer areas, we may need to increase to more waterings, but when seeding, really focusing on a short and frequent watering schedule, right? Since we don't have deep roots established yet, right? But then for the established lawn, we want to transition to more of a deep and infrequent schedule. So Ivana, before we tackle potentially why some of these weeds popped up, do you have any other tips for when seeding?
Not that I can think of besides that, using, some weeds are going to germinate a lot more quickly than the grass will. There's some things that will germinate, within a day. So something that you just kind of have to be mindful of is you might have to go out there and handpick a couple because it's not a very good idea to go spreading any herbicides down whenever you have grass seed coming up. So it is just something that sometimes the weeds will be more quick than the seed. And so you just kind of have to keep on top of getting those out of there if you can.
Yeah, and that is, what I always try to encourage. Unfortunately, the ideal environment for grass seed to germinate is also the ideal environment for weeds to take hold, right? But whenever, while certainly frustrating, I always try to encourage, we're making progress in the right direction, right? Even if we do get at least some grass to establish, we're at least being able to move forward from a long-term perspective. And this ties a bit into our chat on weeds, so it might be jumping the gun here. But really we want to be able to modify the environment to prevent the weeds from ever being an issue, right? And so if we're able to encourage that healthy grass growth, minimize the amount of bare soil available, and not have to rely upon herbicide essentially, right, then that's going to be our focus. So if we're able to seed a large area and we get some grass established but some weeds, we're at least moving in that right direction, right? And if we continue moving in this manner, it's going to take a bit of time, but it's also going to set the lawn up for long-term success, right?
Right, and I see Darren has a question about using leaf compost and having the topsoil over the seed to patch the areas for fall. I would say that's a fantastic idea. You just want to make sure if you're using any compost, you want to make sure that the temperatures are cool enough to seed, because compost is, a hot material. It is actively decomposing, releasing energy. So you just want to make sure that it's not going to burn your lawn. So if you're seeding in ideal temperatures, it'll be an ideal temperature to add that compost. And then adding a little bit of topsoil over that would be great for your seeds.
And
And I would
Darren,
like
go
to,
Bills. This is going to be a big year.
I wanted to make sure you saw that.
Yes. All right. And Vince, suggestions for red thread. Yeah, red thread can be difficult, right? And so from a general disease perspective, right, as we discussed, primarily looking to make sure we're minimizing excess moisture, right, minimize stress to the turf. And if we were to consider a disease triangle, if you will, right, so 3 components. We need a pathogen, right, so a fungus in this case. We need a susceptible host, so in most situations it's stress grass, right, and then also ideal environmental conditions, so typically a very moist environment. And if we're able to break one of those factors, in most situations a fungicide won't be required or additional action won't be required, right? Now red thread is one of those exceptions to the fertilizer rule, right? So red thread is one where we would consider a fertilizer application and can be a sign of potential deficiencies or a change in the lawn, right? So Vaughn, what are your thoughts? Are there any, red thread can really be an indicator of a few different factors, right? But any other tips here?
Mostly just keeping the moisture off the grass. So if you get a lot of morning dew, know that that can be can contribute to red thread. I would make sure that if you are watering, only watering in the morning, because watering at night will leave the water on the leaves for longer. But that's always, when I see a fungus, that's always my first thought, is getting any excess moisture out of the environment that you can, whether that's skipping a watering, whether that's watering at a different time, something like that. All right, I see Ray from Dallas. Hello, fellow Texan. If you've got some zoysia under a few oak trees, the grass is thinning under compared to the full sun areas, which is to be expected. Even very shade tolerant grasses will still be a little bit thinner. So that is something that you're going to want to encourage thickness, which I'll get into in just a second. But I do see the other concern you have is just the sheer amount of acorns that they're dropping in the fall, which is definitely understandable. If you could see my window out here right now, I've also got 2 massive live oaks hanging out and making my grass a little bit upset. So as far as the zoysia, I would say that the acorns are more from a concern from the acorns, it's more of them smothering the grass rather than being very acidic. My first thought would just be to, if you can, rake them out of there. If it's very difficult, you could try using a leaf blower if they're smaller acorns. But my first thought is always just to remove them all at once if you can. If they're dropping them for a couple weeks, let them fall, for that first week, and then remove them the second. But as far as the grass thinning under the trees, it's always going to be something that is something that we're going to have to kind of fight against until they can get it very much established. But for any warm season grasses like zoysia or like St. Augustine that does primarily grow under trees, I recommend top dressing at least, once a year. I usually fall is a good time. So I would say this fall, if you want to top dress those areas, it will encourage the zoysia to fill in. You could also overseed. I can't remember right now if Palisades zoysia does have a seed, but if it does, you could always seed in the spring and top dress then, or you can top dress in the fall and just encourage more growth down there. If you have any runners starting to pop up, you could move those into bare areas and pin them. Usually I say with the unbent safety pin or a bobby pin. But for any shade, the grass will be a little bit thinner, but beefing it up by mowing just a little bit shorter than the rest of the lawn, you could do that. And also just top dressing to encourage new growth.
All right, and Serena from Maryland, sod is being installed tomorrow. Can you start with active lawn, mighty green, or wait? Also stilt grass. So yeah, with sod, right? So sod is going to be installed or going to come installed well fertilized, right? So we do want to hold off on the fertilizer applications. Typically, we're looking just to make sure that the grass has taken root, right? So essentially, while we're following that watering schedule, essentially floating the sod, right, over the typically, what would you say, Vaughn, most likely next few weeks or so, potentially a little bit longer.
Typically, I start with about 3 weeks and then see how well it's rooted.
Okay. We can then just essentially do a pull test, right? See if you're encountering resistance. If not, then we want to wait. But as long as the grass is started to establish those roots or taking root, then we can certainly begin to consider the nutrient pouch applications. But keep in mind that we do want to allow at least 7 to 10 days in between different pouches at least. So I wouldn't look to apply Active Lawn and Mighty Green together. I personally would look more towards potentially Mighty Green initially, and then Active Lawn once the heat dips a little bit. But really, that's getting a bit nitpicky.
I do see, Manja, you have ordered the Dandelion Doom. It doesn't kill crabgrass. It is a selective broadleaf herbicide. So if you see here, it does more dandelions, clovers, thistles, things that aren't going to look like grasses, basically. So any broadleaf weeds, it's, if you want kind of like a visual representation, broadleaf weeds are usually going to be more like the palm of your hand. A grassy weed's going to be more like the side of your hand. So you can check the listing on the bottle. It should list all of the weeds that it covers. But if you have any other specific weeds that you want to know about, feel free to let us know. We can check on that for you as well.
And Ivana, in terms of, so I think this is definitely a big question which came up during the registration process, right? So Weed Warrior is certainly a good option for crabgrass, but any other thoughts? I know, what are your thoughts on gardening vinegar?
Gardening vinegar is a little harsh. Usually if we're going to use a vinegar on the lawn, I would use something more like a distilled white vinegar because it's a little bit softer. Either one may damage your grass, but I would start with the distilled vinegar and see if that'll treat the weeds first. And that way, a lot of grasses will recover from that. And you could, reseed if you need to, something like that. Something like a gardening vinegar is very strong. It'll most likely damage the grass around it, and leave you with a bigger area to patch. But I always try to, start with something like our Dandelion Doom or Weed Warrior. And if that doesn't do the trick, then I'll move on to some home remedies after that. And I see Matt has applied Dandelion Doom 3 times and the weeds have not gone away. It does depend on the kind of weeds, Matt. So I would check the label, check what kind of weeds you have. There are ways to ID weeds, on your phone, things like that. But if you're still having trouble, let us know. I can take a look at them. Some weeds do require repeat applications. There are some things that are more resistant to herbicides, and being in somewhere like Texas, for me at least, the weeds are just harder to get rid of than in other areas just because they're so used to, dealing with harsh conditions. So if something is not, after the 3rd application, I would try to either rough it up first, mow it first, or, kind of stab it with the garden trowel and then apply. Or you can try hand pulling it, something like that. But it does just depend on the kind of weeds. So let us know if you know it. If not, we can help you out with that.
And I would say as well, right? If we're at a point where we're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6 or more applications, right? That's where we really want to reevaluate and consider, okay, what are we working with? So as Ivana noted, just confirming that Dandelion Doom is effective against the weed, identifying if it's prevalent throughout the majority of the lawn. Is there a cultural practice we could adjust to try to limit this weed moving forward? So really good question, but weed control is certainly, we could probably spend an entire webinar chatting about weed control. So really good question. All right, Adam has a question regarding clover. So clover just keeps coming back. What's the best way to get rid of it completely in Eastern Washington? Really great question. And so clover can be an indicator weed, right? And can indicate certain conditions, but it can also be a fairly opportunistic weed, right? And so to a certain extent, we may expect clover to be in nutrient deficient soil, right? Since it is a nitrogen fixer, but that isn't the end all be all, right? I would say the biggest focus for us would be in the short term, if it is starting to go to seed, to mow while bagging your clippings just to minimize further spread. And then in the fall, the biggest focus is going to be for us to treat with the Dandelion Doom, right? Or dig it out and then get some grass seed down to essentially start crowding it out. Won't be an immediate solution again, but it will allow us to start moving in the right direction.
And if you have large patches of it, that usually is an indication that there is something, it likes there better. So if it is a patch that just keeps coming back year after year, I would try to maybe dig up that area a little bit, add a little bit of some compost, something that is very nutrient rich, and then just try overseeding in that area and see if that helps as well. Sometimes if it's just a very specific patch that keeps coming back, there's just something there it really likes, and you kind of just gotta start from scratch in that one area.
Right. And Myron, when to start with the program living in Florida? What should you be doing on new sod? Well, I will say that Florida certainly has its own rules, and we have a bit more flexibility. So ideally, our plans are offered throughout the season, right? And so they will begin truncating throughout the year to account for the shorter growing season. But ideally, I would be looking to sign up in early spring, so February to April or so would be the start, if you will, right? You could certainly sign up now or in the coming weeks to get a smaller plan to close out this season. But just keep in mind that with Florida, we have a bit more flexibility with application dates and when we're applying some of these pouches. So for brand new sod, my biggest focus would be just trying to minimize stress to the area, right? So while it's taking root, floating the grass. So actually more similar, I would say, to a watering schedule for an established lawn than a watering schedule for seeding, right? So essentially providing enough water to, what do you say, it's maybe not quite that 4 to 6 inch mark within the soil, or still pretty close.
I would say not quite, maybe 2-3 inches. But the main thing here is that before it's rooted, as you're watering, you do want to see it move up a little bit. That's why they call it floating. You do just want to make sure you're giving enough water to see the grass lift a little bit, even if it goes right back down. Just to make sure if you're soaking that soil enough, then the grass roots will follow the water, basically. So that's the best way to start getting a very healthily rooted sod going, is to give it more water a little bit less frequently, rather than, like Will mentioned, a seeding schedule, which is very frequent shallow watering.
And keep in mind too that it comes installed while fertilized, right? So I would say fertilizer can be on the back burner for the time being, and just making sure it takes and giving it the best environment would be the priority. But we look forward to welcoming you to Team Sunday.
I see Mary wants to know the difference between Dandelion Doom and Weed Warrior and when they should be applied. So basically, Dandelion Doom, the active ingredient is an iron, chelated iron, and this works on broadleaf weeds, and it won't harm your grass. So it might turn it a little bit darker. That's just the iron in it, but it'll wash away with time. But this is for things like dandelion and clover, thistle, broadleaf plantain, things like that. Weed Warrior is a little bit stronger. That is made of an herbicidal soap that is organic. And it will target basically anything that it touches. It is non-selective. It doesn't really care what it touches. It will damage it. So that's the one you do want to be careful with. If you are going to use it in your lawn, just be prepared to reseed or sod that area. Just know that, it doesn't really care. It's going to kind of target whatever it wants. But both of them should be applied usually in the earlier morning. I wouldn't apply when it's too hot outside. Above 90 degrees is kind of my cutoff. But I would say early morning, just to give it the day to work, and let it work for a few days before applying anything else to that area.
And Ivana, I won't steal this one from you. Shri followed up with a great question regarding top dressing. What is top dressing?
I am glad you asked. So top dressing is, yes, just like you said, using a small amount of topsoil over seeds, but it can also be used as like a full lawn amendment. So if you notice that your ground, and I know this was a registration question as well, so I hope you're here, whoever asked this, if you notice your ground is very hard, very high in clay, or if it's very sandy, something where it doesn't seem like the grass is doing very well, my first thought is always to go to top dressing. Just because organic matter really helps improve the condition of your lawn. It's not an overnight fix. It will be something that you need to do repeatedly. But yeah, top dressing is just adding topsoil or compost, even a 50-50 mix, which is my favorite way to go about it, and spreading that evenly over your lawn. Just a very small amount, a 1/4 inch, or if you're using it while you're seeding, just putting a little bit over the seeds as well. And that will just help retain some moisture, and it'll help have a softer place for those seeds to root into.
Darren, best option to protect patch or areas which you're repairing from pets and other animals while trying to grow grass. Are barriers or a straw type cover better option? Seems like you're feeding all the neighborhood bunnies. So yeah, I would say more so from the straw or the topsoil perspective. To a certain extent, it might help deter it. I would lean more towards bird activity, right? But we're also trying to minimize traffic or essentially any disturbance to the grass itself, right, while it's establishing. So more so from just trying to keep any traffic and minimize stress to the grass, I would say going with the barrier or fencing off the area would be the better option there. So if we could tackle it in sections, right? So identify a portion of lawn and keep the dogs away, for example, or keep some of the other animals away, and then gradually work through this. Depending on where you're at in the country, we might be able to tackle 2 seedings in 1 year, right? One in the spring, one in the fall for cool season grass. Might even have a bit of flexibility with warm season grass as well, depending on when exactly we're looking to repair the area.
And Darren, you can also use some sort of netting. So it looks a little crazy, but I've seen when you're seeding, some people will put a fence around it, but they'll also put a net over that fence just to keep anything coming up from over it, or even just a netting over the grass, maybe an inch or so hovering so that it's not disturbing anything. But that could be another way to keep the bunnies from snacking on your seed. And Ray, I see you want to know more about the pull test and root development. And that's, a pretty simple one. So when you're floating your sod, when you see it come up, that's usually a good thing. But once you start, if it's week 3 and you're floating your sod and you notice it doesn't come up, there might be time to just go over and just lightly tug on the corner of one of your sod pieces. And if it does give you some resistance, I would say it's starting to root, and I wouldn't try to disturb it anymore. But if it still comes up pretty easily, I would kind of take a look under if you can, see if there were roots and they turned brown, that might be a sign of over underwatering. Or if there's nothing there, it might just be taking its time to root. But that's basically what the tug test is, just pulling on it a little bit, seeing if it's rooted, if it'll come up, it's not very well rooted, and if it stays there, then it's rooted.
And Chuck, best weed or grass variety identification app. So I will keep it simple and say, believe both iOS devices and Android devices come installed with, right, Yvonne, right in the photos. I believe there's a little glass, at least my iPhone, and you'll be able to identify some of the weeds. But as you noted, you can certainly do a search on the App Store online to find an app as well, right? I wouldn't say there's a specific one which we'd default to recommending.
We're not the best ones to ask, as we typically know a lot of the common ones. But yes, I would say, like Will mentioned, just any of the best rated ones on the App Store are going to be what I go with. Matt, I see you have a question about dandelions. So for that, I would use our Dandelion Doom. If they are very pervasive in the lawn, just making sure you mow often to get rid of those flowers, get rid of those seed heads, bagger clippings, that kind of thing. If you have, this is the one exception, if you have a very hard soil and you see a lot of dandelions growing, typically I will leave the dandelions there and just clip off the flowers because they have such a strong taproot that they do help break up the soil a little bit. So that would be the case, actually leave them there if your soil isn't great. But if not, then I would use our Dandelion Doom, or if you want to try, hand pulling them, get a little bit of aggression out if you have any, had a bad day, go pull some dandelions, that kind of thing. But they will also weaken after repeated mowings as well. So I would just say, keep on top of it, mow often, bag your clippings. That'll help control them as well.
And Matt, I believe you were following up too about the treating the weeds 3 times, right? So if we're treating dandelions with Dandelion Doom 3 times, hence the name, right? There's something here that I wouldn't necessarily just keep on looking to spot treat, right? So feel free to follow up. But as Ivana noted, there's a point where I'm ultimately looking just to mow while bagging our clippings to knock them back, minimize further spread, and then really prioritize getting the grass seed down in the fall.
Sorry, Matt, I did not realize that was a reference to the question. My apologies. And then Serena, I see you asked about using an herbicide for the massive amount of stilt grass. You could. The herbicides we carry do not treat against stilt grass, but I know how invasive and how pervasive it can be. So if it is something that is starting to really take over, you can reach out to your local extension and they should have some great options on removal. If it is a very invasive weed in your area, they may also have teams that will come out and help you remove it as well. So stilt grass is something that is very difficult to control. So yeah, if you need to use another herbicide, just make sure that it's something that won't harm the rest of your grass. or reach out to your extension for some extra tips there. I see Carolyn asked about nut sedge. So nut sedge is not something that I would hand pull because it does have little bulbs under the soil. So if you were to try to pull nut sedge, it would break off those bulbs and then grow basically 2 more plants afterwards. So that's definitely not what we want. For nut sedge, I would say repeated mowings do start to treat it. I still get nut sedge on my patio, but I no longer actually get it in my lawn because the repeated mowings will start to wear it down. It's not like grass where it comes back very readily from mowing. It does take damage a little bit more personally, I would say, than the grass does. Usually though, it is an indication that your soil can be a little bit compacted or be holding a little bit of water. So when you see nut sedge, you know, it might be something where you need to adjust your watering a little bit or do a compaction test, which is just pushing a screwdriver into your lawn. And if you're met with a lot of resistance, it might be time to aerate, something like that. So usually, if I get a question about nut sedge, my first thought is to check the environment. But as far as a control perspective, just mowing it usually does the trick.
Adam, is bagging your clippings always recommended, or are there situations where mulching in its place is preferred? Yes, so you will see on our blog and when chatting with any of the yard advisors, in general, we do recommend mulching, or essentially grass cycling, right? So allowing these clippings to break down, return these nutrients to the lawn, if you will. However, if we are looking to work through or if there's anything we're looking to contain, right? So weeds are a great example. If we are dealing with a potential disease concern, it's another great example of when we'd be looking to bag. That's the only time I'd be looking to bag. So in general, goal is to be able to mulch whenever possible, but if there's anything we're looking to contain, that's when we could consider bagging.
And I see David had a question about the best way to fill deeper holes in St. Augustine. I would say heavy top dressing would be my preferred way. It depends a little bit on your soil. So a lot of people will like to mix sand in with the topsoil when they're filling these holes. My only concern, is that if it is a clay soil, mixing a lot of sand into clay soils over time will actually harden it. So it's something not a lot of people think about, you know, when they're leveling or anything like that. Adding sand is, you know, the recommended way to level an area. But if you have a very heavy clay soil, it will start to harden over time and mix together and basically form a concrete in your soil. So I would say doing some topsoil or compost, a 50-50 mix, again, my favorite. And then you might just need to do it repeatedly so that when it settles, you know, it'll shrink down a little bit. So just adding a little bit at a time until that area has been filled and the grass can cover it. And I do love Mona Sherry's suggestion here, where she did a drug test on the sod that she got put down and then ended up putting some soil around the edges and had some seed there. So if you are having trouble getting your sod to root, just adding a little bit of seed around it can help it stay a little bit more moist as you're watering those seeds. Sorry, excuse me. And then it will also encourage the rooting because you're watering a little bit more for that sod as well.
Perfect. All right, so we are through all of the questions at this time. So if you've been holding on to any good ones, perfect. All right.
Thank you, Bob.
Central Florida, recommended mowing height. Believe landscaper might be kind of grass a bit too short. Yeah, that's a great question.
It does depend on your grass type, Bob. So I would say if it's St. Augustine, 3.5 inches, even up to 4, I cut my St. Augustine at the highest my mower will go. Most warm season grasses are going to want to be longer. They're going to want to, you know, 3 to 4 inches. They're going to really enjoy. The only exception really being Bermuda grass. So if you've got a common Bermuda grass, you want to mow it around 1 inch. Hybrid Bermuda grasses can go a little bit shorter. They like to be more of a carpet. So it does just depend on your grass type. If you're unsure what your grass type is, we do have a lot of resources on our website where you can kind of decide where your grass is, or if you're still having trouble, you can chat with us as well. But I would just say usually the higher the better, with the asterisk Bermuda. And Tom, I wish I had more information for you. I'm a little bit rusty on torpedo grass. Will, do you have any recommendations? If not, I can
Yeah, that might be one we might be looking to follow up on. I know torpedo
Mhm.
grass can be a bear, right? And I know I've spoken to a few customers who have looked to try essentially wipe out the entire lawn, start from scratch in an effort to remove it. And it still seemed to be pretty pervasive, right? So yeah, we'll follow up with you, see if there's any additional information we can find. But yeah, certainly a difficult weed to work with.
Sorry, Tom. I know a lot of weeds, but that one's always kind of difficult. And I see Robert had a question about the best time to run his sprinklers. I would say most places I would do early morning, so 4, 5, 6 a.m. if you can. The only exception would be somewhere very dry where the grass really needs the overnight moisture to kind of sustain it. So somewhere like Arizona or New Mexico, you can get away with evening watering. I would just say once it's a little bit cooler at nighttime, if you're in somewhere arid, doing evening watering. But for the most part, most of the time I recommend watering in the early morning, just to make sure that the grass is able to take it up, but the water's not sitting on the leaves and incurring some fungal issues.
All right, and Catherine, weeds in the rock beds, herbicides do little to help. So Yvonne, any ideas there?
So weeds and rocks are a little bit hard, especially if the herbicides aren't doing anything. My first thought would be if you have a landscape fabric under there and you're planning on changing up that area anyway, I would actually remove the landscape fabric because it does actually help the weeds after a while. It suppresses them for a bit, and then after that, it just kind of helps them root there a little bit better. But if it's somewhere where you don't know if you have landscape fabric, if you're not planning on digging up that bed or anything, which is totally understandable, that would be something that I look to solarize if you can, if you're somewhere a little bit south. So this is taking like black plastic or something like that and putting it over the areas, very much not the areas where your plants are, doing it around them. But putting a tarp over those weeds will help kind of cook them and kill them, denying them access to sunlight, and raising the temperatures will help. But if no herbicides are doing anything, then that would be my first thought, would be to try to solarize them.
Darren, best pet practices for a healthy lawn. So let's see, we have a few factors to consider here, right? So there are some specific products specifically from Sunday, right? So we offer our pet patch product. So if the primary concern is spotting from the dog urine, right, then I would say a pet patch can be used in more of a regenerative manner, if you will, to help flush the soil of any of the urine contaminants prior to seeding or repairing the area. It can also be used in more of a preventive manner to help minimize spotting throughout the lawn. We also offer our pet lawn grass seed if you are in a cool season area, which is a fescue and rye mix, but designed specifically to minimize spotting. So those two are primarily from a spotting perspective. Additionally, or I guess as a potentially separate factor, if more of the concern is from a traffic perspective, right, where the dogs have a path where they tend to run, right? I know in my backyard there's a very clear line from the back deck to the back fence, but so we could then be considering if there is a bit more of a more traffic tolerant grass. Consider if the area could be a bit compacted, right? So specifically in that area and whether it would be beneficial to aerate. But I would say the primary focus here would be just making sure from a product perspective that we're addressing what we're looking to work through. So whether it's from a urine staining perspective or from a traffic perspective, and then also just trying to minimize stress to the area. So flushing the area if the dogs tend to concentrate in a specific area when going to the bathroom, alleviating any compaction concerns if it's more of an area where they tend to really wear down, etc. So Ivana, any other thoughts there?
I would say my dogs also have a very clear path. And what I like to do is kind of put obstacles in their way to help the grass recover. So I've got a little playpen from when they were puppies. Makes me a little bit sad. But I'll kind of move their traffic a little bit to help my grass recover in those areas. So for example, my St. Augustine doesn't hold up to traffic as well as some other warm season grasses. So if they have a very clear path, down the side of the house, right down the middle, then I'll move the fence a little bit to where they have to go around and go in other areas to help that grass recover. Then you can just move it as needed over the course of the year. And Monashiri for scalping the lawn. This is something I do want to stress very hard, that you only want to scalp Bermuda and Zoysia. Any other grasses aren't going to be as receptive to it. In fact, it will very much damage St. Augustine. So for scalping, you really just want to do it most of the time once a year. There are exceptions. So I would say the first mow of the season would be a time that you want to scalp your grass, get rid of some of that dead material from the dormancy period. And then any other time, if you were to scalp it, it would just be a time where the grass is not already stressed, and it would be to do things like seeding, or if you had a fungus and you let it grow really long, to get rid of the fungus, and then you cut it really short to make it disappear. But I would say for the most part, for healthy lawns, scalping once a year, first mow of the season, only Bermuda and Zoysia.
And to really highlight, as Ivana noted, right, this is not a time where we'd be looking to scalp the grass, right? It's one of the questions we'll receive of, seems like the grass is stalling, or I want to try to kickstart the growth, if you will. That this is, yeah, certainly not an action to complete right now. All right, Elsa, how often to water in Northwest Florida? Really great question, right? And so I would say, yeah, here, we'll just go back here. From watering perspective, so our primary focus would be, and I believe Ivana might have touched on this. If not, I might be thinking of a different webinar here, but really making sure that we're following a deep and infrequent schedule, right? So it can vary in terms of duration and frequency, right? So to your point, lawn in Northwest Florida will differ from a lawn in, let's say, Miami, right? And so grass type can play a factor, region can play a factor, and your irrigation system. So I would recommend starting off with an audit of your sprinkler system just to determine how much water is being put down per session. From there, we're looking to provide at least half an inch of water or so, or to a depth of about 4 to 6 inches. And then from there, we're waiting for the grass to show signs of needing additional water. So the blade's starting to fold in half, potentially adopting a bit more of a bluish grayish hue, footprints remaining in the lawn when walking across the lawn. Those are all great signs that the grass will need additional water. So typically, we're looking at a maximum of 3 waterings per week, and I highly doubt that we're going to be reaching 3 waterings per week, right? We're probably going to be, depending on your grass type, what would you say, about most likely every 3 to 4 days or so?
Yeah, 3 to 4 days is good. Yeah. And then I see Ray again. Hello, Ray. I think you're in Dallas, I believe. Your normal watering time is 4 to 6 a.m. That's fantastic. You've got a randomly dry spot, and it is 104. I definitely feel that. It will not do more harm than good to add a little bit of additional water to that dry spot. For that area, I would recommend hitting it with some extra water in the evening, but only that area, and to monitor it for any disease concerns. If that's the area that stays dry all of the time, I would actually also look into a lawn surfactant. You can use something like our pet patch, something to spray on the lawn right before a watering, and it will help the soil in the area retain more water over time. If you've got a random dry spot, again, I also recommend top dressing, just because organic matter holds water so much better than a very heavy clay soil does. Usually in the Dallas area, it's going to be a little bit more clay based. So just, top dressing for a long-term solution, for short-term solution, adding a little bit of water in the evening, and maybe a surfactant if you feel like it, if it needs it.
Adam, lots of rain in the early summer in Massachusetts, which has brought lots of mushrooms all around the yard. Any tips other than reducing any additional irrigation and mowing the tops off? Yeah, so really good point, right? Primary focus, just making sure we're not providing excess moisture. The only additional tip I would have would be, if you are mowing the tops off, that's great, but I would be looking just to contain those tops, right? To try to minimize the spread. So whether that's plucking them, right, walking around the lawn, or actually bagging your clippings for the time being. And as you noted, I expect as we start to dry out a little bit, we'll see an improvement in the reduction in the amount of mushrooms.
But they do mean that your soil is pretty healthy, so that's pretty cool. I know it sucks to deal with them, but it's nice to know that, something's going right over there. And Robert, I do see that you've got centipede grass. You're currently cutting it at 4. That sounds great to me, especially if you've got a sandy soil. Your grass is going to dry out a lot more quickly, so leaving more length on the grass will allow it to retain more moisture. So I would say leaving it at 4 inches right now would be fantastic. If you notice that it's a little bit thin, and this is something, Ray, I believe we chatted about, thinning grass under your trees, mowing it short every now and again can be helpful just to encourage more lateral growth, encouraging more runners to sprout. Not super short, just going down 1/2 inch or so, but that will kind of signal to your grass that it needs to grow out rather than up. So if you're dealing with any sort of bare areas or a little bit of thinning, every now and again, just mowing a little bit shorter will help encourage some lateral growth as well. But yes, 4 inches is great for centipede. Sorry, I figured I should wrap that back around. And Will, I wanted to see if we had any questions that needed to be addressed from the registration. I think a lot of them were covered under our, our kind of general stuff. Let's see. We don't have any other live questions right now. But I will say, just in general, if Will, you want to take a look at those, if it's very hot and dry where you are right now, I would recommend using something like a surfactant if you can, just because it will stretch your watering just a little bit longer. So something like our water focus, if you have it, something like our pet patch, applying that right before watering will help kind of let your soil retain that water for longer. And especially the case for people with a lot of watering restrictions, this can be kind of a lifesaver for some grasses. So just something to keep in mind as we're still continuing with these really hot temperatures, since it doesn't seem like it's slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's just to realize we're running out of time here, so we'll get wrapped up in just a moment. But just a brief overview in terms of the registration questions, as Ivana noted, right, from a heat stress perspective, making sure we're following that deep and infrequent watering schedule, and potentially allowing the lawn to go gold if we're running into watering restrictions, or we can essentially use this time to conserve our resources and follow up as the temps start to dip. If there are any pouches remaining, we can follow up with those again as the temps start to dip. If weeds are the primary focus, looking to mow while bagging for the time being, just to minimize further spread. And then in the fall, we can reevaluate and determine whether a spot treat, dig them out, etc. And depending on your grass type, we may be heading just into the ideal time to be seeding for a cool season grass, whereas for warm season grass, we may be leaning a bit more into just top dressing for the time being, and essentially developing a plan for next spring, right, and making sure we're in a position there. But I'm sure that there were some questions that we could go into more detail. So if you do have any remaining, please feel free to follow up at webinars@getsunday.com. Always happy to chat and take a look, see if we can provide any additional guidance there. But it was an absolute pleasure being able to chat with you all tonight. Ivana.
I just wanted to cut in really quickly. We'd had a couple questions just very last minute, so I wanted to address those. So Andy, this webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out to you after this. It should be tomorrow. It'll be sent out in an email, and since you're here, it'll be sent straight to you. The whole recording will be available. The slide deck won't exactly be available, but it will be, shown in the recording for Svertar over there. And Melissa, we will have another one in August. Stay tuned for the date on that. I think that was everybody.
All right. Well, keep an eye out for the follow-up survey. Hope to see you at an additional webinar, and have a great rest of your night, everybody. Take care.
All right. Take care, y'all. Have a good one.